the digital revolution has changed journalism in fundamental ways. In that environment, can there be a code of ethics which defines the journalism as a profession? I mean, all professions have a code by which they self-identify and follow. And what do we mean by ethics in the context of journalism? A lot of people would think ethics in journalism is a kind of oxymoron. If there is a code, or there needs to be a code, what is that code to be, and how is that code to be enforced? Now, I'm not sure that our panellists will address all those questions, but I think that they're important questions. And I assume, and I'm encouraged by the fact that so many people have turned up tonight, that people who are our audience and our readership are concerned about what are the ethical standards that we apply to the work that we do. How often do we break those standards? Do we think about those standards very much? And I'm sure our panellists will address these issues as well.
I'm going to try to be perhaps a bit provocative on this subject and begin by saying, or paraphrasing Hans Jost, the Nazi functionary who said famously, "When I hear the word culture, I reach for my revolver." And I'm afraid when I hear the words journalism and ethics, I reach for my revolver. Because I think those two words together are very often misunderstood. Usually a third word comes with it, with those two words, which is professionalism, and journalism as a profession. And I guess I'll confess right at the beginning that I don't believe that journalism, properly speaking, is a profession at all. A profession, by definition, is something like law or medicine, where you indeed have to pass some sort of professional examination or licensing to enter in, and to thereafter follow certain guidelines in your behavior and your actions. Journalism quite conspicuously lacks that. I know it does in the United States. I believe it does also in Australia. Journalism, it seems to me, is much more of a craft, a guild, whereby people in general wanting to enter in are trained by their superiors, usually, sometimes in journalism school, but more often in newsrooms. Different newsrooms very often have rather different ideas of ethics, and that is, I think, to begin with, based on the fact that journalism, at the end of the day, is a collection of commercial institutions. In the United States, there's an awful lot of talk of the First Amendment. It's what we wave around when we want to separate journalism from other commercial activities. We say, well, there's the First Amendment, there's the right to know, etc. In fact, the First Amendment, as it relates to the press, can be summarized, or actually, I'll quote it. The words having to do with freedom of the press from the First Amendment, the Constitution, are Congress shall pass no law abridging the freedom of the press. That's it. That's all the Constitution says, which is to say that it's simply a precept, a law, that prevents Congress from interfering with the press. It says nothing about what the press should do. And what the press decides to do, and of course when we say the press or the media, we're talking about a great number of different companies ranging from very much the penny press, pulp kinds of press forms, whether in broadcast or in print, all the way up to the New York Times or the Age or other high-quality newspapers. They have very different standards, and to some extent they're in competition with one another. And this is a main point I'd like to make, that those forces of competition inevitably weigh on notions of ethics. I'm going to give an example here. I was going to title my remarks, decided not to, but I was going to title them "The President and the Blowjob." Someone hissed. That was Hillary, I think. I was going to use that title because it seems to me that that moment in 1998, where not only was President Clinton's, how shall we put it, sexual indiscretion reported in the press, but it became the center of an enormous event that continued for 18 or so months and led to the second impeachment of a president in United States history. He was not convicted, of course, but he was impeached. It seems to me marked a kind of turning point in where we are when it comes to what the press does, how it behaves, and perhaps what the future of it is going to be. Why is it a turning point? Because though many other presidents before Bill Clinton, possibly since, have enjoyed indiscretions of that sort in the White House, President Kennedy is notable for that, it was never reported before, and it of course never constituted scandal on that level. Why? I would answer by saying that this was in a sense the arrival of the press in the internet age. That is, President Clinton's affair with Monica Lewinsky was originally reported, was known about by various people around the White House, including some reporters at Newsweek. They did not report it. They tried to get it into their pages. Editors made decisions not to. They based those on certain ethical precepts, certainly that we can talk about. But at the end of the day, the Drudge Report, which was an internet outlet, still exists, ran with it. And the press suddenly, the so-called high-quality press or mainstream media, MSM, suddenly found itself unable to hold back those floodgates and found itself having to take a story which a few years before, and certainly 20 years before, never would have made it into the press at all. It might have been a rumor, so on, suddenly became the center of the news of the United States and led to the impeachment of the president. I think this says a couple of things. The first is that competition, economic stress, commercial development, and technological development trumps ethics. That is to say, ethics follows behind. Point two, we're in a period, it seems to me, of deterioration, degradation, possibly preceding some kind of reformation. We don't know. But the press is going through a kind of crisis right now that is both structural, which is to say, how will the internet affect newspapers and other organs of the press? How will newspapers reconstitute themselves so as they can make money in the internet age? And all of the other questions associated with that. That's a structural crisis. And of course, together with the structural crisis and making it worse is the cyclical one, which is to say just the economic crisis, which is driving so many parts of the media out of business, and so many newspapers, certainly in the United States, out of business. Those two things together, it seems to me, have exacerbated a kind of crisis in ethics. What should journalists do? What are the guidelines they should follow? What are the subjects that are open to them? Can you report about the president's personal life? That question, before 1998 and the Monica Lewinsky crisis, the answer to it probably would have been no. Most journalists now, I think, if asked the question, would probably also, and again, answer no. But the fact is that is specifically a kind of sexual indiscretion, which was the Monica Lewinsky scandal. But the fact of the matter is that when competitive forces put that subject front and center in the American media, even if in the suburb of the American media, then known and now known as the internet, competitive forces forced it into the center again.
I got this topic, I thought, well, look, I should at least reacquaint myself with the Age's Code of Conduct, which has been around now for 12 years. I have to admit I hadn't read it for, I think several years, and the MEAA's, the union's Code of Ethics as well. And reading them was interesting because despite what Mark says, and I agree with him to a large extent, at a day-to-day newspaper at that level, ethics do come up all the time, often very quickly, making quick ethical decisions, but they're still there. The Age Code of Conduct was particularly designed to deal with the standards that are required of professional journalists at the Age, and I want to come back to that word professional also, because the era of what we thought of as a professional journalist, maybe the paid journalist, is gone in this era. It's sort of dead. But a few words struck me from the Age Code of Conduct. It was, the code's an important statement about how we behave in our professional lives, how we relate to newsmakers, how we relate to sources, contacts, colleagues and the public. It gives guidance to the high ethical standards required of those who work at the Age. We were setting ourselves apart there even then about standards at the Age were meant to be high, perhaps higher than some other media. Overriding principles, fairness, integrity, openness, responsibility, commitment to accuracy and truth. Sustaining the highest editorial standards is essential to us retaining the trust of the community was a central point, and the freedoms and responsibilities afforded to us by the community. Things like plagiarism, conflict of interest, privacy. Point 3 states that staff should seek to present only fair, balanced and accurate material. Grand-sounding words, I thought, as I read this, and they're followed in the breach a fair bit, but there's still, those issues are still ones that we deal with every day. We have a commitment, even though it is under strain in this era, we still have a commitment to be honest and fair as much as we can, or can in a competitive world.
Succinctness is sweet. But is there a point at which the returns start diminishing along with the word length? In striving for an ethical media, is it nowadays possible to assume too much and say too little? What's the best way to widen a conversation which in media circles has been murmuring, I wouldn't put it any louder than that, for more than 100 years? To these 3 questions I answer yes, yes, and carefully with an eye on 3 factors. First, consult as you compress. Let people who are familiar with the bulk see the process by which it's reduced to the bite-sized. Second, engage respectfully with newcomers. They may be unaware of the mass of hard-won material from which nuggety dot points were extracted. And third, be open to rethinking the forms in which you have been expressing your dearest. Maybe the technologies and the newcomers will lead you to better forms. Media professionals are no longer a priestly caste. This does not mean they have nothing of value to offer an information society that takes ethics seriously. I think what I just said makes sense. I think it's enough. It rests on lots of thinking about media ethics and how to communicate them in ways that work by people, especially in Tony's profession. But is what I've said so far enough for you? Can you make sense of it? Is it so brief it mystifies? So short, it stumps. So distilled, it's flavourless. Before you can decide whether it contains anything of interest to this evening's topic, maybe you need to hear more, and maybe I need to say more. So much for the hazards of compression. What are those hazards? You must face that question if, like me in my present job, you deal with the ought of self-regulation more than you deal with the must of law. In media self-regulation, the question takes on greater significance when, as now, technologies of communication are having 2 powerful effects at the same time. First, the technologies are democratising the means of making irretrievable public disclosures. This used to be the preserve of those who worked in large publishers and broadcasters, a priestly caste that was able to shield itself from the scrutiny it applied to others. Second, the technologies seem to privilege most those who communicate briefest. Less is much. Two practical reasons for this seem to be the way search engines operate and the fact that there's just a sheer mass of material all clamouring for attention. A third reason, I think, is social media.
First, the philosopher's skill in handling large-scale theories about the nature of morality puts him or her in a good position to spot and expose deep misunderstandings about ethics that are often current in a community. Some simple examples are the pervasive beliefs that what is right or wrong is totally a matter of what culture or religion or individual feeling dictates. These beliefs are all false and indeed mutually inconsistent, and it's a service for philosophers and anyone else who cares to show as much. Behind each of these common, often instinctive beliefs can be found such moral philosophical theories as cultural relativism, divine command ethics and subjectivism. Simple versions of these theories are easily disposed of, though there are more interesting, complex versions that might have something to offer a general understanding of morality. One background theory that's worth considering here is role morality. This is the approach that seeks to find moral norms and constraints in the idea of the role that an individual occupies in society. It seeks to show that many, if not all, of one's obligations and duties can be drawn non-mysteriously from one's role in social life. Each of us lives in settings that create expectations, demands, empowerments and privileges concerning our behaviour, and out of this web of connections come our duties and obligations. A doctor has certain privileges, like that of cutting up parts of your body, but also certain attendant duties, like seeking your consent and full disclosure of risks. Now, this theory of role morality has been very influential in the area of professional ethics, within which discussion of media ethics usually takes place. Of course, we all occupy many and varied roles in our lives, but one very central role concerns our work, and there the idea is that the sort of occupation we have by its nature sets moral limits, objectives, values and constraints upon how we ought to behave. In the case of journalism and related media activities, this emphasis helpfully directs us to the idea that the key value of journalism is to publish significant truth. Newspapers and so on have many other functions, of course, to entertain, to run at a profit where that's required to keep the enterprise going, to preserve standards of clarity and style in writing, to provide stuff to wrap fish and chips in, though that's declined somewhat as a function in recent years, and so on. But all these are subservient to the point of the enterprise, and that point is significant truth, or if you like, information. I prefer truth because it's a guiding value in all our lives, and I'm deeply unimpressed by various postmodernist assaults upon it and upon the related values of objectivity and evidence. Of course, there are problems about what we mean by objectivity, and I'm happy to discuss them later if the point arises. Once significant truth is seen as a central value for the profession, then it brings with it other moral perspectives, virtues, a concern for consequences, obligations, prohibitions and so on. These are all part of the moral framework that we all work with, but certain aspects of them are crucial to journalism. The virtue of honesty in dealing with news, the obligation not to be intimidated in the search for significant information by political pressures or undue fear of authority, the need to give people affected by your activities a chance to be heard where their views are relevant, the requirement to respect confidentiality in sources, though I think this is a derivative and somewhat ambiguous moral imperative. Of course, role morality is not enough by itself. It's implanted in a wider context of ordinary common sense morality that applies whatever one's role in society. So moral rules against lying, cheating and stealing and so on apply right across the board, though they're open to interpretation and even exception. Recently I was quoted in The Age on this English parson who said that really destitute people might be entitled to steal from department stores, and I think he's probably right. Similarly, with more positive moral concerns such as duties to help those in distress, the requirement to respect privacy, moral obligations to one's own family, obedience to the law and so on. All of this can function perfectly smoothly, but there can also be cases where different virtues, values and obligations come into conflict. I'm reminded of the case of the ABC TV reporter in Haiti recently who felt such a clash between his professional duty to observe and report faithfully and his human duty to help the victims by travelling to another part of the country to scrounge medical supplies for the victims. What he said was, as a reporter, I'm not supposed to get involved, but these people desperately needed something I could get. How one settles these sorts of clashes is not a matter for me to declare. Indeed, it's not to be settled from on high at all, but by the pooling of ideas and discussion of real examples amongst the people involved in the relevant profession or job. Out of that sort of dialogue might come some considerations, some rough and ready rules for handling these sorts of situations. One of the virtues that seems to me very important in journalism is courage, in particular the courage to stand against mere fashion, against the implicit mindset of the day, against the pressures of those powerful people who think they know what is best for the country or the city. In democratic societies, we probably have more to fear from self-censorship than public censorship. In World War I, there was plenty of public censorship, but the British press avoided every loophole or opportunity to present in any way glimpses of the tremendous horror in the trenches. The London Times explained this policy as follows, quote, "A principal aim of the war policy of Printing House Square was to increase the flow of recruits. It was an aim that would get little help from accounts of what happened to troops once they became soldiers." In the context of that absurd and tragic war, this sort of patriotism was a misplaced exercise. But in the context of any war, the official story, the press releases and the controlled propaganda from the military are there to be challenged and probed, not simply swallowed. Finally, on the matter of journalistic self-censorship, which I've just touched, which can of course be unconscious, I feel impelled to end with a poem, or at least a piece of doggerel, from Humbert Wolff, who wrote in 1930. It goes as follows. "You cannot hope to bribe or twist, thank God, the British journalist, but seeing what that man will do unbribed, there's no occasion to." Thank you.